We are bringing former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Wesley Clark. General, it's always good to see you and help us understand this. How would Trump's Golden Iron Dome work, and where would you put it?
Well, I think the most logical place to put it is in space. And this is the follow on to the Reagan system called Brilliant Pebbles. So you'd have a multitude of interceptors in space, and they would detect intercontinental ballistic missiles being launched, and they would be able to shoot down and intercept them in the boost phase before the missile picks up speed, before it can release decoys or other things that would help it penetrate a conventional ground-based missile defense. Now, that would be the first layer. And then you'd have a second layer, which are long-range interceptors. And then you might have over critical U.S. infrastructure, like the National Capital Region, something like exactly like the Israeli Iron Dome system. So you need layered defense. Whether $100 billion is sufficient, probably not. But it's imperative that we get started on something like this because in a world of multiple nuclear powers who are potentially hostile, the idea of mutual assured destruction, which was the deterrence of the Cold War, that's not going to work anymore, especially when countries like China can bring a fractional orbital bomb in from any direction. So the trick is the right intelligence, being able to discriminate what's a nuclear missile versus a satellite launch, doing it early, and then having a layered defense. That's the way it should be done. The technology is there. There are a lot of policy issues on this, Natasha. For example, if we've got these interceptors orbiting over the Pacific and orbiting over China and orbiting over Russia to intercept the boost phase, they might have the similar thing at some point over the United States.
Right.
We might be uncomfortable with that because they might not be interceptors. They might be something that could actually launch from a satellite straight down at the United States that couldn't be intercepted. So there's a lot to be discussed in this, but it is important that we focus on strategic defense, move forward from the old concept of mutual assured destruction.
Yeah, the space part of all of this is fascinating. And of course, it begs the question, which country are you most concerned about in terms of targeting us? I know you mentioned China. Is it China?
Well, I think for President Trump, it would be China because he hopes that Russia will become a friend. But if we don't do something about Iran, it's also Iran and it is North Korea. Because North Korea has the capacity now to attempt to strike the United States. And maybe some of the missiles wouldn't work, but maybe some would. So the thing is, for space-based defense, it's in orbit. And unless it's in geosynchronous orbit, it's moving over the land masses below. So it doesn't stay fixed in a position. Now, if it's 23,000 miles up, it's going to have a hard time intercepting something in the boost phase. So you've got to have a lot of lower orbiting satellites. That means they're not stationary in the sky. That means they're flying over a lot of other nations who aren't hostile. It also means you've got to have an awful lot of them.
Yeah, and you bring up the fascinating question of how do you prevent other nations from just floating their own satellites, their own systems directly above us. All fascinating. I do want to pivot to the war in Ukraine. I want to ask you about the likely future here as we're seeing statements from Zelensky saying he is ready to come to the table. But you mentioned North Korea. And so I do want to ask you about a specific report we're seeing about the North Korean soldiers who are fighting for Russia right now, being told by their governments not to be captured alive or their families will be executed. We know more than 10,000 North Korean soldiers are in Russia to fight right now. Why kill their families? Why that threat? Why the insistence from North Korea's government that their soldiers not be taken alive?
Well, I think the North Korean government, of course, has always been very eccentric, and it's determined to have its soldiers fight to the death. And so there's no better way to have a soldier fight to the death than tell him he's fighting for his family's life. And then if he gets captured, his family's life is forfeit. Now, that's a cruel way of looking at things, and certainly we wouldn't do that as Americans. But this is also illustrative, Natasha, of the value systems of the adversaries that we're facing. So we know, for example, in the Second World War that the Russians put machine gun troops behind their line of advance. And there's reports that they've done the same thing in Ukraine. So a soldier that gets cold feet and said, you know, I'm running into bullets. I need to stop and get a better orientation on this. He's going to get shot by his own colleagues from behind. And this is a different way of waging war. It's not the values of the United States. It's not what makes our army great. It's what makes their armies weak.
It's always illuminating speaking with you. General Wesley Clark, thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your screen. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.